Inside Pelican Bay Prison, America's most dangerous Supermax. The sound of steel doors slamming shut echoed through Pelican Bay. Inside the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, a man sat in a small concrete cell with no windows. The light never turned off. He hadn't touched another human being in years. His world was 4 gray walls, a metal bunk, and silence. Yet somehow, inside these cages, the most powerful gangs in California still gave orders that reached every corner of the state. And one day, the silence was broken with violence so shocking that even the guards whispered about it for years. It started with a single shout, echoing down the tier. Then came the pounding of fists against doors, hundreds of inmates joining in until the entire block shook. Suddenly, a shower of sparks lit up the hallway. An inmate had hidden a makeshift weapon, and the guards knew they were seconds away from losing control. What happened next would leave blood on the floor and headlines across America. But how did a prison designed to crush crime become the place where crime grew even stronger? To understand, we need to go back to the beginning. Pelican Bay State Prison was built in 1989 in the remote forests of Northern California. It was created to hold the worst of the worst, men who ran gangs, carried out murders, and caused chaos in other prisons. The state wanted a place where leaders of the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, and Black Guerrilla Family could be cut off from their soldiers on the streets. The SHU was the answer. Windowless cells, 23 hours a day in isolation with 1 hour in a barren concrete yard shaped like a dog kennel. The idea was simple: break the chain of command. At first it seemed to work. Gang leaders were locked down, communication lines cut, and violence in other prisons went down. But Pelican Bay became something else entirely. Instead of stopping crime, it became the headquarters. Leaders used coded letters, smuggled notes called kites, and even secret messages hidden in legal papers to send orders outside. From a tiny cell, a single inmate could control drug trafficking, extortion, and even contract hits across the state. The guards knew this, but every time they tried to break the cycle, the gangs pushed back harder. Sometimes it was small, like a fight in the yard or a hidden stash of weapons. Other times, it was an explosion of violence that reminded everyone just how dangerous Pelican Bay really was. One morning, during a routine cell search, officers opened a steel door and stepped inside. At first it looked normal, bed neatly made, no obvious contraband. But as they lifted the mattress, they froze. Hidden inside was a weapon so sharp it could slice through a guard's vest. And that wasn't all. Carved into the metal was a single symbol, a gang mark like a silent warning. The officers knew right then. Someone inside was preparing for war. And just days later, the prison would erupt. The alarm blared, red lights flashing against the cold concrete. Inmates surged forward in the yard, fists clenched, eyes locked on each other like predators. What began with a single shout turned into chaos. 2 rival groups charged, weapons flashing in the morning sun, homemade knives, sharpened metal hidden for weeks. Guards scrambled, firing warning shots into the air. But nothing stopped the storm. Men collided, blood sprayed across the gravel, and the smell of iron filled the air. In minutes, the yard looked like a battlefield. The guards rushed in with shields and batons, beating men down, dragging bodies across the dirt. Sirens screamed. By the time it ended, several inmates were lying motionless, and dozens more were cuffed, faces pressed into the ground. But this wasn't just a random fight. It was a message. The gangs had shown they could still control Pelican Bay, no matter how deep the walls or how heavy the locks. The prison went on lockdown. Meals were slid through slots. Silence returned to the halls. But beneath that silence, the tension only grew stronger. And soon, the violence would return in an even darker form. Weeks later, the quiet was broken again. Guards discovered another secret weapon stash, this time hidden inside a legal folder sent from the outside. Pages of fake legal notes concealed blades, sharpened down to deadly points. It proved what the prison feared most. The gangs weren't just fighting inside. They were running a criminal empire beyond the walls. Outside California, drug deals and extortion payments were being ordered directly from these cells. Inside, alliances shifted and betrayal festered. One night, in a dimly lit cell, an inmate whispered through the vent to his neighbor. The deal was simple: kill a rival before sunrise and his family on the outside would be protected. When morning came, guards found an inmate slumped in his bunk, blood pooling beneath him. The murder weapon? A piece of metal sharpened from the very frame of his bed. Once again, Pelican Bay had turned into a stage for violence that seemed unstoppable. The prison's answer was harsher isolation, longer lockdowns, and stricter rules. But the more they tried to choke the gangs, the more creative the inmates became. And then came the event that shook Pelican Bay to its core. It was supposed to be a normal escort. 2 guards chained an inmate for a walk to the showers. He shuffled slowly, head down, silent. But the moment they turned the corner, he struck. Hidden in his waistband was a razor blade, so thin it had escaped the searches. With one swing he slashed at a guard's face, leaving a crimson streak down the officer's cheek. The other guard tackled him, the hallway exploding with shouts and the sound of fists against steel. Reinforcements came, tackling the inmate to the floor, blood dripping onto the concrete. The officer survived, but the attack sent fear through the entire staff. If an inmate could hide a weapon in the most secure prison in America, what else were they hiding? The lockdown that followed was suffocating. Inmates were confined 24/7. Even their 1 hour of yard time was stripped away. But Pelican Bay was a pressure cooker, and the pressure only built higher. Anger boiled over in the chow hall. For the first time in weeks, a small group of inmates were allowed to eat together under heavy guard. The tension was thick. Plates clattered. Eyes darted. Then, without warning, one inmate flipped his tray, food flying through the air. He lunged across the table, fists swinging. Within seconds, the room erupted. Guards rushed in, batons cracking against bodies, tables overturned, food smeared across the walls. It was chaos all over again. The inmates were dragged out one by one, shackled and bleeding, their screams echoing down the corridors. But as violent as it was, the Chow Hall riot wasn't the end. In fact, it was just a distraction. Because while guards were busy putting out that fire, something even more dangerous was brewing in the cells. Hidden inside a solitary cell, an inmate had been writing for weeks. His letters, filled with tiny coded words, were smuggled out by corrupt staff and hidden in stacks of legal mail. These weren't love letters. They were blueprints for a statewide gang war. The coded notes instructed soldiers on the streets who to hit, when to move, and how to smuggle drugs back into the prison. The discovery of one letter sent shockwaves through the warden's office. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison anymore. It was the headquarters of a criminal empire. But before officials could act, word leaked inside the prison that someone had been snitching. That night, the lights went out in one block and screams filled the darkness. When guards rushed in, they found a man stabbed over a dozen times, his body crumpled against the wall. He hadn't stood a chance. After the murder, the warden ordered the harshest lockdown Pelican Bay had ever seen. No visits. No phone calls. No letters. Cells were stripped bare, and guards stormed through tiers with dogs, searching for weapons. They found dozens, shanks hidden in vents, razor blades tucked inside soap bars, even knives made from melted plastic. But stripping the cells didn't strip the gangs of power. In fact, it only hardened them. Some inmates began banging on the doors day and night, turning the blocks into drums of defiance. Others refused food trays, starting hunger strikes that spread across the prison. The strike made headlines. Families on the outside rallied, accusing the prison of torture, pointing to the endless years men spent in solitary. The world was watching now. And that pressure would soon spark another extreme event inside the prison's walls. The hunger strike grew so massive that hundreds of inmates refused meals. Trays stacked up outside the cells, untouched. Guards dragged away the weakest, bodies frail from weeks without food. The prison feared men would die, and outside, protesters shouted at the gates demanding change. Inside, the gangs seized the moment. With guards stretched thin and medical units overwhelmed, whispers of another uprising filled the halls. In one block, an inmate tore his mattress open, pulling out a weapon he had hidden for months. He carved a message into the wall with it: "The fight isn't over." That night, as the guards dimmed the lights, fists started pounding in rhythm. First one cell, then another, until the entire block thundered like a war drum. Everyone knew what it meant: something big was about to happen. The next morning, the storm hit. As guards opened the first cell door for showers, an inmate lunged forward, stabbing with a shank fashioned from sharpened metal. The guard screamed, collapsing as chaos erupted all over again. Sirens blared, tear gas filled the halls, and reinforcements poured in with shields. Inmates smashed their fists against doors, shouting threats, cursing, demanding freedom from the SHU. The sound was deafening, like a riot waiting to explode in every block. Guards fired pepper spray and locked down every corridor. The attack left staff injured, inmates beaten, and the entire prison on the brink of war. Pelican Bay was supposed to be the place that broke men. But instead, it had become proof that no wall, no door, no chain could fully contain the violence inside. And the darkest chapter of its story was still to come. After the stabbing of the guard, the entire prison fell into a suffocating lockdown. Every inmate was trapped in their cell around the clock. Meals were shoved through tiny slots. Showers were suspended. Lights stayed on through the night, leaving men to pace back and forth like caged animals. The prison leadership knew they had to regain control fast. They brought in tactical units armed with shields, pepperball guns, and attack dogs. Cell by cell, they dragged men out, stripping them, searching for contraband, tearing apart their bunks, even smashing toilets to see if weapons were hidden in the pipes. For a moment, it looked like the crackdown was working. But in Pelican Bay, calm always meant the storm was around the corner. The gangs had already adapted. Instead of weapons, they turned to their voices. Through vents, inmates spoke in hushed tones, sending messages across tiers. Through plumbing pipes, they tapped codes like Morse. Even with chains on their wrists, they were still building plans. And then, something even more terrifying surfaced. Investigators discovered a coded letter that revealed the gangs weren't just planning fights inside. They were orchestrating murders on the outside, from the heart of solitary confinement. Pelican Bay had become more than a prison. It was a command center for death. The news hit the staff like a gut punch. They thought locking men away in silence would stop them. Instead, isolation had only sharpened their hunger for power. Guards braced for what would come next. The next eruption came during something as routine as medical rounds. A nurse walked the tier, handing out medication cups through the slots. Most inmates took them in silence. But at one door, an inmate tossed his pills to the floor and refused to move. When guards ordered him to comply, he spat a curse and slammed his head against the steel door. The bang echoed down the hall like a drumbeat. Suddenly, other cells joined in, fists slamming, voices shouting, metal rattling. Within seconds, the tier sounded like it was tearing itself apart. Guards rushed in with shields, trying to silence the chaos, but one inmate had already prepared a weapon. As the door opened, he lunged forward, slashing with a jagged piece of glass. Blood sprayed across the wall, and the hallway erupted into screams. It took hours to regain control. When the smoke cleared, guards were shaken, several inmates injured, and the medical unit in chaos. Yet to the gangs inside, this wasn't just a fight. It was proof they could turn the smallest moment, pills, food, showers, into war. And if the prison thought this was the peak, they were wrong. The biggest eruption hadn't even begun. The warden's response was absolute. He ordered the entire SHU block stripped bare. No radios, no books, no contact with the outside world. But Pelican Bay was a pressure cooker. Stripping the little they had only fueled rage. That's when the hunger strikes returned. This time bigger than before. Dozens, then hundreds of inmates refused trays. Food stacked up in the hallways. Water cups sat untouched. The men grew thinner each day, their faces sinking, bodies trembling with weakness. Guards dragged the worst cases to the infirmary, forcing tubes down throats to keep them alive. But the strikes weren't just about food. They were a statement against solitary confinement. Outside the prison, human rights groups marched, shouting through megaphones, "Pelican Bay is torture." Families of inmates joined them, holding up photos of sons, brothers, and fathers locked away in cells no bigger than a bathroom. The state couldn't ignore it. Politicians began asking questions. News crews parked outside the gates. Suddenly, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was a national scandal. And the inmates inside knew they had the world's attention. But while some saw the hunger strike as protest, others saw it as opportunity. Behind the walls, gangs were already plotting to use the chaos for their next violent move. And when it came, it would leave the prison scarred forever. It happened on a gray morning, during what was supposed to be a controlled yard release. Just a handful of inmates were let out, shackled at the wrists, 2 guards for each man. The prison thought it was safe. But in Pelican Bay, nothing was safe. The moment one inmate's cuffs came off, he spun and attacked. Hidden inside his waistband was a shank, sharpened from metal scraped off a ventilation cover. He drove it forward with terrifying speed, aiming straight for the guard's chest. Another inmate joined in, fists flying, turning the yard into an ambush. Guards screamed into radios calling for backup. Pepper spray filled the air. Warning shots cracked overhead. Dogs barked as they lunged, dragging men to the ground. The attackers didn't stop until they were beaten down and dragged away, their faces bloodied, their eyes still burning with rage. The incident left multiple officers wounded and the prison shaken to its core. The message was clear. Even in the most isolated, tightly controlled Supermax in America, violence was always one breath away. Pelican Bay had been built to crush the worst of the worst. Instead, it became their fortress. A place where silence turned to strategy, and isolation only sharpened the will to fight. And the question that echoed far beyond those walls was chilling. If Pelican Bay couldn't break them, could any prison in America? The yard ambush changed everything. The state called in outside investigators, demanding answers on how inmates were still smuggling weapons and plotting attacks. Guards were furious. Many felt abandoned, forced to fight wars they couldn't win. The union staged protests, holding banners that read, "Protect staff, not criminals." Inside, the lockdown grew harsher. Inmates were cuffed and shackled for the smallest movements. Showers happened once a week. Mail slowed to a crawl. Yet even under those conditions, the gangs thrived. One intercepted letter revealed the shocking truth. Leaders inside Pelican Bay had ordered hits on rivals in Los Angeles, San Diego, even as far as Arizona. Pelican Bay wasn't just surviving, it was spreading. And then, a moment came that showed just how much control the inmates still had. During a head count, a guard noticed something odd. A man wasn't responding. When they opened the door, they found him slumped, his body covered in tattoos carved deeper into his flesh during the night. It wasn't just self-harm. It was initiation, a message that the gangs were alive, and nothing could break their grip. The shock left officers rattled. If men could mark their skin under 24-hour surveillance, what else could they do in secret? The next storm brewed inside the chow hall. After weeks of bland food, watery beans, stale bread, half-rotten fruit, tension boiled over. One inmate refused his tray. Then another. Soon, dozens were tossing their food to the ground, stamping on it, turning the hall into a scene of defiance. Guards rushed in to drag them out, but the moment the first officer grabbed a man's arm, chaos erupted. Trays flew through the air like weapons, hot liquid splashed across uniforms, and fists slammed against steel tables. One inmate leapt onto a guard's back, choking him with a chain from his restraints. Others pounded their fists into the walls, creating a thunder that echoed through the entire block. It took pepper spray, tear gas, and dogs to finally clear the room. When the dust settled, the hall looked like a war zone. Food smeared across the walls, broken trays littering the floor, men coughing and spitting blood. But the message was clear. Pelican Bay's inmates weren't afraid of the system. They were the system. And while staff scrambled to recover, a darker plot was already in motion. It started with a rumor. Guards heard whispers of a green light, a coded order for coordinated violence against staff. At first, it seemed like paranoia. But then, evidence surfaced. A kite smuggled between cells that listed names of officers, their schedules, even the times they walked the tiers. Fear spread through the staff. Every step down the hallway felt like walking into an ambush. Some officers quit. Others doubled down, carrying themselves with hard stares and tighter grips on their batons. And then the rumor became reality. One morning, as a team of guards escorted inmates back from medical, a prisoner broke free of his chain. In his hand was a shank hidden in the seam of his jumpsuit. He lunged forward, stabbing wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs. His target wasn't another inmate this time, it was staff. The hallway exploded into violence. Officers swung batons, blood splattered, alarms blared. Reinforcements poured in, dragging the inmate down. But the damage was done. Several guards were injured, and one lay on the ground gasping for breath, his uniform soaked in red. Pelican Bay had crossed a line. It wasn't just inmate versus inmate anymore. It was inmates versus the system itself. And the question loomed over everyone: how far would this war go before the walls themselves couldn't hold it? After the hallway stabbing, Pelican Bay turned into a fortress within a fortress. Staff wore riot gear even for routine searches. Entire blocks were stripped down, and inmates were cuffed tighter than ever before. But fear spread among officers. No matter how much steel they locked behind, the gangs always seemed one step ahead. That's when investigators uncovered something chilling. Inmates weren't just communicating through kites and whispers, they were using corrupt staff. A rookie officer was caught smuggling in cell phones and SIM cards hidden in food packages. On those phones, investigators found text messages, bank account numbers, and even orders for drug shipments moving through Los Angeles. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Pelican Bay wasn't just dangerous because of the inmates, it was dangerous because the corruption ran both ways. Guards now looked at each other with suspicion. Who could be trusted, and who was already working for the other side? And just as those questions filled the air, an even deadlier event unfolded. It happened during a rare outdoor yard release. The men were brought into the dog-run cages, tiny concrete pens with high walls where they could barely see the sky. At first it was quiet. Some did push-ups. Others paced. But then 2 cages over, a man screamed. By the time guards ran over, blood was already splattered across the concrete. An inmate had hidden a sharpened piece of metal in his waistband, and he was using it with precision, stabbing again and again through the fence at a rival in the next cage. The victim collapsed, clutching his side, while the attacker roared in defiance. Guards fired pepper spray into both cages, the mist choking everyone nearby. But the damage was already done. The rival was dragged away bleeding, and the attacker was hauled back into solitary, grinning through swollen lips. Pelican Bay had turned even its most controlled environment into a battlefield. And the gangs were proving that no wall, no matter how high, could stop blood from spilling. After the Yard attack, the state launched a full investigation. Cameras were installed everywhere. Mail was censored more strictly. Phones were monitored. But even under those conditions, the gangs found ways to adapt. Through hidden notes, they began planning coordinated hunger strikes again. This time they weren't just refusing food. They were demanding transfers, better treatment, and an end to indefinite solitary confinement. The protests spread across the prison like wildfire. Entire blocks refused trays, leaving guards to drag out men whose bodies had shrunk to skin and bone. Outside the walls, families joined the fight, holding protests, waving signs, "End the SHU." Reporters swarmed the gates. Politicians debated whether Pelican Bay had gone too far. But while the world argued, something darker was happening behind the scenes. Within the hunger strike, certain inmates weren't starving, they were plotting. Guards discovered coded notes ordering gang soldiers on the streets to carry out attacks on rivals in Los Angeles. The hunger strike wasn't just a protest. It was cover. And soon that cover would explode into violence inside the prison itself. The violence erupted in the middle of the night. Guards making rounds heard a scream, followed by pounding fists. When they reached one cell, the sight froze them in place. 2 inmates had torn apart a cellmate using a weapon carved from a broken broom handle. The victim's body was left sprawled across the floor, a gang symbol scrawled in his blood on the wall. The discovery of the hit list set Pelican Bay on fire. Officers were no longer just worried about gang wars inside, they were terrified that they themselves were now the targets. Every shift began with body armor. Every hallway walk felt like stepping into enemy territory. Some officers even requested transfers, unwilling to risk their lives in a prison that felt more like a battlefield than a workplace. The warden ordered emergency crackdowns. Entire units were searched cell by cell. Bunks ripped apart. Toilets smashed open. Mattresses sliced. In the process, guards uncovered dozens of hidden weapons, shanks carved from toothbrushes, razor blades tucked inside Bibles, even knives molded from melted plastic trays. But for every weapon found, there were 5 more waiting. The gangs had perfected their craft. They could turn anything into a weapon. And worse, they had something the guards didn't: loyalty. Inmates moved like soldiers, taking orders from leaders locked in the SHU. And then came a chilling reminder of just how dangerous that loyalty could be. During a routine escort, one inmate suddenly turned on another, stabbing him repeatedly in full view of officers. He didn't even try to escape. When he was tackled to the ground, he smiled through bloody teeth and whispered, "Order complete." It wasn't about survival. It was about obedience. And Pelican Bay had just proved it was less a prison, and more an army barracks for America's deadliest gangs. The state of California couldn't ignore it any longer. Politicians stepped into the debate, questioning whether Pelican Bay had made things worse instead of better. Human rights groups shouted for the SHU to be shut down. Families demanded their loved ones be moved. Guards, meanwhile, demanded stronger weapons and harsher rules to protect themselves. The prison became the center of a storm no one could control. And then came the hunger strike that shook the nation. Thousands of inmates across California prisons joined in solidarity with Pelican Bay, refusing food. For weeks, trays were untouched. Men collapsed from weakness, their bones showing through their skin. Hospitals filled with inmates on feeding tubes. The strike caught worldwide attention. News crews broadcast the frail faces of men locked in windowless cells for decades. Was this security or was this torture? The question split the nation. But inside Pelican Bay, the gangs didn't care about headlines. They were using the hunger strike to cover up their next big move. A coordinated attack that would spill more blood than anything before. The attack came in the most unlikely place, the infirmary. Several inmates had been brought in for medical checks after refusing food for weeks. They looked weak, barely able to stand. Guards relaxed, believing these men were too fragile to fight. But the weakness was a trick. The moment one guard leaned in, an inmate exploded with strength, pulling a hidden shank from his waistband. Another followed, lunging at staff. Within seconds, the infirmary turned into a battleground, Blood spraying across sterile white walls, nurses screaming, medical trays crashing to the floor. Reinforcements stormed in, pepper spray and batons swinging. Inmates were dragged out, leaving behind injured staff and a room that looked like a war hospital. The message couldn't have been clearer: Pelican Bay wasn't under control. It never had been. And if the gangs could turn even medical treatment into a weapon, then nowhere inside those walls was safe. After the infirmary ambush, the governor of California stepped in personally. He announced sweeping changes: new surveillance systems, new restrictions on mail, and even talks of dismantling parts of the SHU. But for the officers who walked the tiers, speeches meant nothing. They still faced danger every time they opened a cell door. Inside, the inmates adapted yet again. With fewer weapons to smuggle, they turned to psychological warfare. Some screamed all night, keeping guards awake. Others flung human waste through slots, laughing as officers gagged. The war was no longer just physical, it was mental. And then, another extreme event ripped through the prison. A guard was cornered while escorting a single inmate. The man, shackled at the hands and feet, suddenly twisted free and tackled him to the ground. With his chains, he tried to choke the officer, dragging him into unconsciousness. By the time backup arrived, the officer was seconds from death. Pelican Bay had reached a breaking point. Guards no longer asked if violence would happen. They asked when. The breaking point came during a full-scale yard riot. Rival gangs, locked away for years, finally clashed face-to-face after a brief release. It started with insults, then escalated to fists, and then erupted into chaos. Dozens of men charged each other with hidden shanks, swinging fists, and bone-crushing kicks. Guards fired warning shots into the sky. Tear gas filled the yard. The sound of rubber bullets cracked through the chaos. But the inmates didn't stop. They fought through clouds of gas, slipping in blood, dragging rivals across the gravel. By the time the riot was over, dozens lay injured, and the yard looked like a battlefield. Helicopters circled overhead. Medics rushed in. The incident made headlines nationwide, once again branding Pelican Bay as America's most dangerous supermax. By now, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was a war zone that stretched beyond its own walls. Guards moved like soldiers, every step laced with tension. Inmates lived in shadows, their minds sharpened by decades of isolation. Outside, the nation argued. Was Pelican Bay keeping America safe, or was it creating monsters no cage could contain? Then came the incident that sealed its reputation forever. It was a foggy morning when officers escorted a small group of inmates to the yard. The air was damp, heavy with silence. Suddenly, without warning, two men exploded into violence. From nowhere, shanks appeared, razor-sharp blades hidden in body cavities and smuggled past searches. They struck fast, stabbing again and again, not at rivals this time, but at the guards themselves. The yard turned into chaos. Officers screamed into radios. Gun towers fired warning shots that echoed across the forest. Tear gas filled the air, thick and choking. Dogs lunged, dragging men to the ground. But the fight didn't stop. Even shackled and bleeding, the inmates roared like warriors who had nothing left to lose. When it was over, the yard was a field of bodies, guards wounded, inmates bloodied, the gravel stained dark red. Helicopters circled overhead, medics rushed in, and the warden himself stood at the edge of the chaos, staring at a truth too big to ignore. Pelican Bay was built to be America's most secure supermax. But in trying to bury the worst of the worst, the prison had created something even more terrifying. A place where gangs thrived, violence never died, and silence itself became a weapon. Today, Pelican Bay still stands, hidden deep in the forests of Northern California. To some, it's a fortress that keeps the public safe from the most dangerous men in America. To others, it's a symbol of cruelty, proof that isolation can break the mind but never kill the will to fight. Inside those concrete walls, the battle between control and chaos never ends. Every locked door is a challenge. Every silence hides a message. And every day both inmates and officers wonder the same chilling question. If Pelican Bay cannot break the men inside it, then what prison ever could?